Berlin, 1943. The city was suffocating. The hum of war, relentless and oppressive, draped itself over Berlin like a thick fog, a suffocating blanket woven from smoke, suspicion, and the heavy scent of death. The streets, once alive with the vibrant energy of a city proud of its heritage, had grown desolate, haunted by the slow march of a Reich too caught in its own delusions of power to see the cracks forming beneath its feet. The winter had long since abandoned any semblance of mercy, leaving only the biting cold that gnawed at the skin and tore at the spirit. Yet, it was not the frost that froze the hearts of the people, it was the war, and its corrosive effect on everything it touched. Daniel Carter moved through the shadowed streets of the city, his eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced caution. He had been in Berlin for nearly 2 months now, slipping between identities with the ease of someone accustomed to wearing the skin of others. His true name was not Daniel Carter. His true face was not this one. But in this moment, he was simply another foreign journalist, a neutral observer, drifting through the city like a leaf on the wind, unnoticed and unseen. But in truth, Daniel had not come to observe. He had come to infiltrate, to survive, and to gather what little scraps of information he could that might tip the scales in favor of the Allies. His mission, though well-defined, felt as murky as the smoke rising from the city's factories, blending with the ever-present darkening sky. On paper, it was simple: connect with a contact and informant embedded deep within the Nazi establishment, someone who could provide critical intelligence about the inner workings of the Reich. That person was Elena Weiss, a translator for the High Command, a woman whose loyalty was as obscured as her true motivations. There were whispers, rumors even, that she was not the simple translator she appeared to be. Some claimed she was a collaborator with the British Special Operations Executive, others said she was playing both sides, feeding information to anyone who would listen. The Allies had their eyes on her, but they had no proof. No concrete evidence that she was working against the Reich. Daniel was to find that proof. Or, if necessary, create it. The bitter wind whipped through the alleyways, pulling at the edges of his worn coat as he made his way toward the safe house, a dilapidated apartment in a nondescript building, tucked away in the heart of the city. It had been arranged with meticulous care, a place where shadows moved with the same weight as reality, and where even the air seemed to tremble with the constant sense of danger that thrummed beneath the surface of everything. Inside, Elena Weiss waited. He had heard her name long before he'd ever seen her face, and in every whispered conversation, every report, every briefing, she had been painted as a figure of mystery, a woman as elusive as smoke, as dangerous as fire. The briefings had been clear: trust no one. But when the words trust no one had been spoken, they hadn't been referring to people like Elena Weiss. They had been referring to people like him. Daniel had learned to trust his instincts long ago, and his instincts told him that Elena was different. There was something about her that didn't sit right with the clean lines of the Reich's propaganda, something that hinted at something darker, something more complex. She was no mere traitor. She was a woman at war not just against the Reich, but against the very notion of loyalty itself. Daniel reached the door of the apartment, his gloved hand pausing for just a moment before he knocked twice, sharply, in a pattern he had memorized. A long silence followed. And then, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing Elena Weiss, standing in the doorway with her cool, calculating gaze fixed on him. She was dressed simply, yet with a certain elegance, her features sharp, yet softened by the shadows that clung to her face. The dim light of the room behind her spilled into the hallway, casting long, jagged shapes across the floor. "Daniel Carter, I presume." Her voice was soft, but it carried an authority that seemed at odds with her appearance. He nodded, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "The same." She stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Come in. I trust you brought the documents." "I did." Daniel removed the small, flat package from inside his coat, handing it over to her with a steady hand. His gaze flicked to her face, catching a momentary flicker of something unreadable as she took the package from him. Her fingers brushed against his for the briefest second, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with an unseen tension. She didn't acknowledge the touch, nor did she seem to register the unspoken question that lingered in the space between them. Instead, she took the package to the small wooden table in the corner, placing it carefully down before unwrapping it with a precise and practiced motion. "Is there anything else?" she asked, her voice smooth but guarded. Daniel's eyes followed her every movement, the way she worked with such focus, such control, as if her life depended on it, and, in a sense, it did. Every action, every gesture, was deliberate. He had seen that in the people he had met before, those who played this dangerous game of espionage, where trust was a currency that ran out faster than one could spend it. "Not yet," he said. "But I'll be in touch soon. We'll need to move quickly." She didn't reply right away, and for a moment, the silence in the room felt heavy, laden with the weight of secrets too dangerous to voice. Daniel could feel her eyes on him, assessing, calculating, as if she were measuring the truth of his words, probing for any sign of weakness. She had the look of a woman who had seen too much, who had lived too long beneath the veil of deception. "You don't trust me," she said suddenly, her voice almost a whisper, but there was no accusation in it, only the cold, detached recognition of a shared truth. Daniel looked at her, his face impassive. "Trust is a luxury we can't afford." She nodded, as though this answer was both expected and understood. The silence stretched between them once more, stretching tight like a wire, both of them walking that razor-thin line between allies and enemies. "I'll get the information you need," Elena said at last, breaking the tension. "But you must understand, the risk is high. The Nazis are everywhere, and they are always watching." Daniel studied her carefully, his mind racing through the implications of her words. He knew the stakes. They both did. The clock was ticking. Time, in war, was always the one thing you could never get back. "I understand," he replied quietly, his voice low but certain. "But we have no choice." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Outside, the faint sound of distant artillery rumbled through the city, a constant reminder of the war that raged around them. But inside the small apartment, for the first time, it felt as if the world outside had been shut out, if only for a moment. Elena met his gaze once more, her eyes cold, her resolve unbroken. "And if you fail," she asked, her voice sharp as a knife, "what happens then?" Daniel didn't flinch. His answer was simple, but it carried with it the weight of everything he had lost and everything he stood to lose. "Then we all die." The silence stretched between them, as if the city itself held its breath. Outside, the faint rumble of artillery continued its relentless march, a reminder that this was a city under siege, a city on the precipice. Daniel knew, in the pit of his stomach, that the consequences of failure were not confined to himself. No, they reached far beyond his own skin. Every mission, every move he made, would echo through the vast web of wartime strategy, affecting lives on both sides of the conflict. But the stakes now were personal, too. The lives of the people he cared about, if there were any left who mattered, hung in the balance, suspended between his choices and his hesitation. Elena Weiss had her own motivations, but what they were, Daniel couldn't yet say. He had learned early on in this war that understanding the true nature of a person was a luxury only the dead could afford. The living had to act, to respond, and to survive, often at the expense of anything that could even remotely be considered an ideal. Elena had been operating in the shadows for years now, entrenched within the heart of the Nazi war machine, acting as both translator and, according to some sources, a conduit for resistance. But where did her true loyalty lie? Daniel had learned not to trust anyone who was too good at hiding their true intentions. And Elena was a master at hiding. Her calculated demeanor, her controlled movements, all spoke to a woman who had lived through too many lies, who had seen the grotesque face of war and knew better than to let anything, including her own emotions, betray her. War, Daniel knew, didn't just demand sacrifice, it demanded a reordering of the human soul. The line between right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, had become as blurred as the smoke that rose from the burning ruins of cities like Dresden, like Hamburg, like Berlin. Once, in another life, perhaps even before the war had torn everything apart, he would have believed in the simplicity of those concepts. But now? Now, everything was a matter of survival. His survival. Her survival. The survival of those who had been caught in the crossfire of this savage conflict. Daniel's mind returned to the moments before Elena had opened the door. His heart, as always, had been pounding in his chest, the adrenaline of the operation pushing his senses to a razor's edge. This wasn't the first time he'd stepped into the lion's den, but each time felt like a gamble, each time felt as if it could be his last. As a British operative inserted into Germany under a false identity, Daniel had been tasked with a mission that was part of a broader strategy of subversion and sabotage. The Allies had known for years that the Nazi war effort relied not only on brute force but on maintaining the myth of invincibility, a myth that had begun to fray at the edges after Stalingrad, after the collapse of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Berlin was the beating heart of that myth, and it was here, amidst the rebel and the propaganda, that Daniel was to find the pieces of truth that could bring it down. But as much as he understood his role, as much as he understood the importance of the mission, the human cost weighed heavily on him. The lines had long since blurred. The objective now wasn't merely to infiltrate and gather intelligence, it was to survive long enough to make a difference, to extract something of value from a place where every conversation, every meeting, was a risk. He had no illusions about who the enemy was, and yet he was forced to trust people who might be just as dangerous as the forces he was working against. The war, after all, had no room for simple morality. But the context of this mission went beyond his personal survival, beyond the task at hand. This was 1943. The war had shifted. The tide was turning in ways that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The defeat at Stalingrad had sent shockwaves through the Axis, a blow to the myth of the Reich's invincibility that had reverberated from the Eastern Front all the way to Berlin's grandest halls. And yet, despite these blows, the Nazis clung to their ideals as if their survival depended not on pragmatism, but on the continuation of their fanaticism. Hitler's vision for Europe, for the world, had consumed everything in its path: families, cultures, cities, and dreams. Daniel's eyes flicked to the small radio in the corner of the room, its soft crackle a constant reminder of the propaganda that saturated every corner of Berlin. In a city where everyone was a potential spy, where every whisper could be the beginning of someone's downfall, the air itself was thick with distrust. In the midst of this, Elena was a cog in the machine, her hands stained by the work she did for the Nazi High Command, translating reports, orders, and directives that would eventually make their way to the front lines. But whether or not she was also feeding secrets to the Allies, feeding them information about the Reich's most sensitive operations, was a question Daniel had yet to answer. As she stood by the table now, inspecting the package he had handed her, her every move was precise, calculated. Daniel couldn't help but wonder just how far she had gone in her deception. Was she playing both sides? Or was she truly a loyal servant of the Reich, hiding behind a facade of betrayal to protect herself? The stakes of their interaction were not only about what they could do for the war effort. They were about survival. Survival in a city where every shadow could conceal an enemy, where the Gestapo's reach stretched into every corner, and where an innocent gesture might be the very thing that tipped the balance between life and death. The Allies must win, Daniel said softly, almost to himself, as his eyes lingered on the shape of Elena standing at the table, her back to him. He wasn't sure why he had said it out loud. Perhaps it was a quiet affirmation, a reminder of why he was here, why he continued on. There was no romanticism in the war, not anymore. But in this cold, unrelenting war, the cause mattered. They all had to hold on to something that justified the suffering. Elena turned, her eyes narrowing as they met his. "You believe that?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Or is it simply the line you've been fed?" Daniel's lips twisted into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe it's both. The cause, and the line." "Lines are dangerous things," she replied, her voice even. "They blur. They change." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "They do." For a moment, the weight of those words hung in the air between them, charged with the tension of a shared understanding. Elena knew the truth of what he said. She knew that the war wasn't about good versus evil anymore, it was about survival, and about playing the long game. About navigating a world where the lines between loyalty and betrayal were so thin they could snap at any moment. And yet, in this fractured reality, both of them had chosen their sides. Both of them had chosen to risk everything, to step into the shadows and play a game where the stakes were not only high but existential. Daniel wasn't sure when it had happened, when he had gone from being an agent of the British government to something else, something less defined. All he knew was that as the war raged on, as the city of Berlin continued its slow, inevitable descent into ruin, he was no longer just a soldier. He was a survivor. And survival, in the end, was all that mattered. "You're a difficult person to understand, Daniel Carter," Elena said, her tone softer now, but still sharp with suspicion. "Maybe you'll never understand me," he said, his voice low, almost a challenge. "But I don't need you to. I just need you to help me finish this." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the city stretched beyond, dark and bruised under the weight of the night. She knew as well as he did that there would be no peace in Berlin until the war was over, and that peace, when it came, would be forged in the blood of those willing to take the hardest risks. "It won't be easy," Elena said, her voice distant now. "And we may not survive it." Daniel stood, his body stiff with the tension of the moment. He knew the risks. He had known them from the very start. But he had no choice. "Then we make sure they don't survive us," he said, his words resolute. Outside, the distant rumble of war echoed once more, a cruel reminder of the world they both inhabited. And in that moment, neither of them knew how close they were to the edge or how much further they would have to go before the truth was revealed, or before they would be forced to choose between loyalty and survival. The next day, the cold was sharper, more biting, as if the very atmosphere had grown resentful of the human traffic beneath it. Daniel moved through the streets of Berlin, his mind preoccupied with the last conversation in Elena's apartment. The room, with its oppressive quiet, had left a lingering sensation in his chest, a sense of unease that gnawed at him like a small but persistent hunger. He had come to Berlin with a singular purpose, to infiltrate, gather intelligence, and report back to the Allies. But the complexity of his mission had begun to settle in, the realization that his target Elena Weiss was far from a simple collaborator. She was an enigma. And enigmas were dangerous. They were harder to manipulate, harder to control. But now, the world outside had begun to close in around him. There was no more time for careful observation. The fragile web of alliances he had been constructing was about to snap. Every move he made from here on out would have to be calculated, every step taken with the knowledge that it could be his last. The safe house was too close to the heart of the city, too exposed. He had to leave Berlin soon, but before that, he had a job to do. His mission wasn't just about surviving, it was about retrieving information that could bring the entire Nazi war machine to its knees. The problem, however, was that retrieving it meant dealing with the labyrinthine network of Nazi officials, spies, and informants, all of whom had their own secrets to hide. It was at the edge of the Tiergarten, in a cramped, run-down pub where Daniel had arranged to meet his contact, a fellow British operative embedded deep in the German bureaucracy, when the first complication arose. The pub was crowded, the air thick with smoke, the clink of glasses, and the low murmur of voices. Daniel slipped through the door, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room for the face he had been briefed to look for. The contact was supposed to be a man named Walter, an office clerk in the German Ministry of the Interior who had been leaking critical information to the British. His cover was impeccable, and for months, Daniel had been relying on Walter's intel to make his moves. But today, as he approached a table in the corner, Daniel's instincts flared. There was something wrong. A figure rose from the shadows, one that Daniel had not been expecting. It was not Walter. It was someone else entirely. Someone who had no business being here. Helga Brandt. Daniel's heart skipped a beat, a cold shiver running down his spine. The SS counterintelligence officer was a name he had heard whispered in hushed tones, a woman who could tear apart entire networks with nothing more than a glance. She was not a woman who should have been in a small pub, not in a place where spies like Daniel operated freely. The fact that she was here, in this very moment, meant one thing: someone knew. And that someone was coming for him. Helga smiled as she saw him, her lips curving into a cold, predatory grin. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice smooth, cutting through the noise of the pub. Her eyes glinted with a strange, calculating intelligence. "I was wondering when we would meet." Daniel's mind raced. His immediate thought was to retreat, to vanish into the crowded streets and disappear into the shadowy corners of the city. But it was too late for that. Helga was watching him with the keen interest of a predator who had found her prey. There would be no escape. Not now. "How did you know I'd be here?" he asked, his voice steady, though the tension in his chest threatened to crush him. Helga shrugged, the movement slow and deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. "I have my ways." Her eyes flicked to the table where the now empty seat had been. "Your contact, Walter, has been delayed, I'm afraid. And I'm certain you already know why." Daniel's heart sank. Walter had been compromised. The man who had been feeding him information, the man he had trusted, was now a liability. "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel said, his voice almost too calm. Helga's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You're in over your head, Carter. You thought you could play this game without consequences, without someone noticing the little holes you've been poking in the Reich's fabric. But you're not the only one with eyes." The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. His cover was blown. He had underestimated the SS's reach, their ability to root out even the smallest fissures in their grand machine. And now, there was nowhere to hide. "I'm not sure I understand," Daniel said, trying to maintain some semblance of control, even though his mind was already plotting his escape. "What is it you want from me?" Helga leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "The same thing you want, Mr. Carter. Information. And I believe you have something that belongs to me." A chill ran through him. She knew about Elena. She knew about the information Daniel had brought from the heart of the Nazi High Command. The game had changed. No longer was he simply a British operative gathering intel. He was now a man trapped in a game of cat and mouse, and Helga Brandt was playing for keeps. "What do you want?" he asked again, his voice a low growl. Helga straightened up, stepping back and taking a moment to look him over, as if appraising him like some rare commodity. "You will deliver everything you've gathered, Mr. Carter. Every scrap. And you will do it quickly. In return, I'll allow you to continue breathing. Otherwise..." She let the words hang in the air like a threat, their meaning clear. Daniel's mind raced. He could refuse, of course. But Helga's reputation preceded her. She was not a woman who made idle threats. To cross her was to sign his own death warrant. "I'll consider your offer," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "But understand this, I'm not working for you. I'm not on your side." Helga's laugh was cold, cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "You'll be on my side when it suits you. Don't pretend otherwise." She turned and began to walk away, leaving Daniel to stew in the heavy weight of the situation. He knew, without a doubt, that this encounter had changed everything. He had been playing a dangerous game, but now the rules had shifted, and he was no longer in control. The moment Helga left, Daniel's first instinct was to flee. He had to leave the pub, find a way to warn Elena, to make sure that nothing he had gathered could be traced back to her. But as he stepped outside, he realized something more urgent. The SS were closing in. They were no longer just shadows in the streets, they were active, looking for him, closing off his escape routes. The city of Berlin, once familiar, had turned hostile. Every alleyway, every darkened corner now felt like a trap waiting to snap shut. He had to make contact with Elena. He had to warn her. But how? Where? The only place he felt remotely safe was the apartment he had shared with her, and he knew that it had already been compromised. If Helga was this close, it was only a matter of time before the Gestapo would come for them both. His pulse quickened as he moved through the streets, dodging the occasional patrol and slipping into the shadows whenever he saw someone suspicious. He was good at this. He had always been good at staying hidden, but now he was a target and targets had a way of being found. As he neared the rendezvous point, Daniel's mind swirled with the consequences of his next move. His options were narrowing, and the choices left were dangerous. But there was no turning back. There never was. He had to find Elena. He had to make sure the information didn't fall into the wrong hands. And time was slipping away faster than he could control. The wind had picked up, tearing through the narrow streets of Berlin with a force that matched the urgency in Daniel's chest. His mind raced, but his body moved with precision. Years of training had conditioned him to respond to danger without hesitation. Yet the weight of his situation pressed down on him like an iron vice, its grip tightening with each step he took through the city. The streets were no longer just streets, they had become a labyrinth of surveillance and suspicion. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every passerby could be an agent of the Gestapo. The war had changed the world into a place where everyone was a suspect, and Daniel was no exception. The encounter with Helga Brandt had been the catalyst. It had changed everything. What had once been a straightforward mission, gathering intelligence, reporting back, and fading into the shadows, had now spiraled into a desperate struggle for survival. The fragile web of trust he had been weaving with his contacts was now in tatters. Walter was gone. Helga was watching him. And Elena? Elena was in even greater danger than he had imagined. He couldn't afford to think about what might have been. He had to focus on what was in front of him, the immediate threat that loomed over his every move. Daniel's feet carried him quickly through the streets, his senses attuned to every sound, every flicker of movement. He had to find Elena, but he couldn't afford to walk straight into her apartment. The Gestapo would be watching her building by now. The best he could do was move in the general direction of her neighborhood, then find a safe place to wait until he could make contact. The minutes were slipping away, each one adding more weight to the decision he was about to make. As he passed an old market square, he noticed a familiar face, a fellow operative, a man who had once been part of the underground network, but whose loyalty had always been suspect. Marcus. The man was slouched against a stone pillar, his posture too casual for a spy, his face half hidden under the brim of a hat. The moment their eyes met, Daniel felt the familiar jolt of distrust. Marcus wasn't someone he would have chosen to rely on, but he also wasn't someone he could afford to ignore. "Daniel," Marcus said, his voice low, his accent thick with a blend of fear and calculation. You've been seen. Daniel's stomach tightened. By whom? He demanded, his voice barely a whisper. The usual, Marcus replied, his eyes darting around as though expecting someone to spring out of the shadows at any moment. They're looking for you. The Gestapo's been asking questions about your movements. They've started to piece things together. Daniel cursed under his breath. He had underestimated how quickly the net would close. The SS were good at tracking people, and the Gestapo had become experts in piecing together fragments of information into a dangerous whole. I need to contact Elena, Daniel said, his mind working at a furious pace. Do you have a place I can lay low for a while? Marcus hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously as if weighing the cost of his decision. Finally, he nodded. I know a place. It's not far. But you have to promise me something. Daniel raised an eyebrow, wary. What? Marcus leaned closer, his voice even quieter. You're not the only one in danger. If you're seen with me, it'll be the end for both of us. Daniel nodded. There was no time for promises. Take me there. Now. Marcus led him through winding alleyways, moving with the kind of deliberate care that came from years of evading notice. They passed through hidden doorways, secret passages, and even a butcher's shop that Daniel would have walked past 100 times without recognizing. Marcus's contacts in Berlin were scattered people who knew how to disappear, how to survive in the cracks of a city that was increasingly under the thumb of the Reich. They finally stopped at a nondescript apartment building on the edge of the city. It was a place Daniel had never been, but the fact that Marcus knew it meant there was a chance it was still safe. The apartment was cramped and smelled of stale cigarette smoke, with faded wallpaper peeling from the walls. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dull, yellowish glow over the bare furniture. Marcus gestured for Daniel to sit at a small wooden table in the center of the room. As soon as they were seated, he locked the door behind them. I can't stay long, Daniel said, his voice tight. I need to reach Elena. She's the key to everything now. If I don't warn her... Don't say her name too loudly, Marcus interrupted, his voice low and sharp. The walls have ears, and you're not the only one looking for her. Daniel's frustration flared. I don't have time for this, Marcus. You don't understand. The Gestapo is already closing in. If we don't act fast... Do you think I don't know that? Marcus hissed, his eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and anger. I'm trying to help you, Daniel. But if you're smart, you'll listen to me now. You can't go to Elena's apartment. They'll be waiting for you. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm himself. He didn't have the luxury of being patient anymore. His instincts screamed at him to go, to find Elena, to warn her. But Marcus was right, he couldn't risk walking directly into a trap. I know a way to reach her, Marcus said after a moment, his voice quieter now. It's not safe, but it's the only way. There's a contact, someone who works in the same building as Elena. She's been helping with some of the intel. She can get a message to her. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Who? Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he didn't hesitate. Her name is Ingrid. She works on the 5th floor of the building next to Elena's. She's one of us, someone who's been feeding information about the Reich's movements. She'll help you. Daniel stood abruptly, his pulse quickening. How do I find her? She'll be at a small cafe on the corner of Bismarckstrasse, Marcus replied, his voice clipped. She'll be expecting you around 3 p.m. You'll know her by the red scarf she always wears. Daniel didn't wait for Marcus to say anything else. He turned on his heel and left the apartment, moving quickly down the narrow hall. Time was running out, and every second spent hesitating brought them closer to disaster. The cafe was a small, dimly lit place, tucked between two crumbling buildings. The windows were fogged with condensation, and the smell of strong coffee and stale bread filled the air. Daniel entered, his eyes immediately scanning the room for any sign of Ingrid. She wasn't hard to spot. She sat alone at a corner table, a red scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, her back straight, her posture rigid. He approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the worn wooden floors. She looked up as he arrived, her face impassive but her eyes betraying a flicker of recognition. "You're Daniel Carter," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation in the cafe. "I've been expecting you." Daniel sat down, leaning in close. "We don't have much time." Marcus said you could help me reach Elena. I need to get a message to her immediately. Ingrid hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the door, then back to Daniel. It's dangerous, but I can do it. But you need to know something first. Daniel's brow furrowed. What? Ingrid's voice dropped even lower. There's a leak in the network. Someone close to her has been feeding information to the Gestapo. You're not the only one at risk. The message you want to send might be the very thing that puts her in even greater danger. The room seemed to close in around Daniel. His thoughts raced. A leak. Someone close to Elena. It meant that everything he had worked for, the fragile threads of trust they had built, might be worthless. I have to trust you, he said, his voice tight with urgency. You have to help me get to her. Before it's too late. Ingrid nodded once, sharply. I'll do what I can. But if you want to get out of here alive, you need to be ready to make hard choices. Daniel didn't reply. He didn't have time for any more questions. There was too much at stake, too many risks to weigh. He only knew one thing for certain now. There was no turning back. The clock ticked with a steady, oppressive rhythm. Time, that cruel enemy, was slipping away faster than Daniel could grasp it. The message had been delivered, the contact made. Elena knew that the Gestapo was closing in, and now, Daniel had only one choice left, to act before everything he had worked for came undone. But in this moment of desperate urgency, there was more at play than just the survival of a mission. There was the human cost, the lives that hung in the balance, including his own. The decision had become inevitable. He had spent weeks calculating every move, every word, every moment, but now the stakes were far beyond the cold logic of espionage. This was personal. And it was not a decision he could make lightly. The apartment he had been staying in had been compromised. The safe house Marcus had offered him was no longer secure. The streets outside felt like a battlefield, every corner a potential ambush, every alleyway a trap. Yet, through it all, Daniel's focus remained singular: Elena. The woman whose life was as entwined with his own as the fate of the war itself. It had been a cold, calculated gamble from the beginning. He had never truly trusted her, not completely. But she had proven time and time again that she was a player in the same game, a woman who understood the cost of betrayal, who, in her own way, had been as lost as he was. Their fates had crossed at a pivotal moment, and now, standing on the precipice of the final act, Daniel realized that the mission had ceased to be just a matter of duty. It had become a matter of choosing sides. The street outside the cafe was lined with the crumbling facades of Berlin's war-torn buildings, their windows shattered from countless bombings. The sky above was a dull grey, heavy with the threat of more destruction. Daniel watched as Ingrid slipped into the crowd, a shadow among shadows, her red scarf just visible before she disappeared into the chaos of the city. There was no time to waste. His only goal now was to find Elena and escape. He moved through the streets with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years dodging detection. But even with his well-honed instincts, the air around him felt electric with the tension of being watched. Every pair of eyes seemed to turn toward him, every sound too sharp, too sudden. The Gestapo were close. He could feel it. His thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in the cafe. Ingrid's warning had been clear: there was a leak in their network. The Allies had been betrayed, and the traitor was someone Elena trusted. The weight of that knowledge felt like a stone in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that the betrayal was closer than he thought, that the very person he had believed to be his ally might be the one who would bring everything crashing down. And yet, despite everything, his mind kept circling back to Elena. The streets seemed to close in around him as he neared her building. He slowed his pace, carefully assessing every figure that passed. There was no safe path now. No way to simply slip in unnoticed. His cover was blown, his identity compromised. If the Gestapo hadn't already found him, they would be on his trail any minute. But his feet kept moving forward. He had to see her. He had to know what came next. The building loomed ahead, its stone walls pockmarked with scars from previous air raids. It looked almost normal, like any other apartment complex in the city. But Daniel knew better. Behind its unremarkable facade, danger awaited at every turn. He approached the entrance, slipping through the door with the practiced ease of someone who had become intimately familiar with the movement of a city under constant surveillance. As he ascended the creaking staircase, each step felt like a decision that brought him closer to an end he could not avoid. When he reached the third floor, the door to Elena's apartment stood before him, slightly ajar, a faint light spilling into the hallway. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Something wasn't right. The air was thick with tension, as though the apartment itself had been waiting for this moment. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was eerily quiet. The familiar clutter of books, papers, and half-empty glasses was gone. The floor was swept clean, the chairs tucked neatly under the table. It was as if Elena had vanished, leaving only traces of her presence behind. But as Daniel's eyes scanned the room, they landed on a single piece of paper lying on the table. He moved toward it cautiously, his heart beating faster now. The paper was a message, written in a careful, precise hand. It was a letter from Elena. Daniel. By the time you read this, I will be gone. You were right to be suspicious of me. I never expected to feel the weight of betrayal so deeply, but it is my reality now. The war has taken everything from me, and I've made choices I cannot undo. I knew the moment I met you that we would be caught in this web, and I hoped, foolishly, that we could survive it together. But I've come to realize that survival is not a certainty for anyone, not in this world. The Allies are right to trust you. You've always been loyal to the cause. But I have failed in my own way. I must leave before the Gestapo come for us both. I've made arrangements for your escape. They are waiting for you at the safe house in Nuckeln. Goodbye, Daniel. Perhaps we will meet again in another life. Perhaps. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he read the letter, its words sinking in with the weight of finality. Elena had known all along. She had known about the traitor in their ranks, the one who had betrayed them to the Nazis. And she had known that, in the end, there was only one way out. Her departure was a final act of both betrayal and sacrifice. He felt a deep pang of regret, a sickness settling in his gut. He had trusted her, even when he had known better. And now, she had left him with nothing but a letter and the faint hope that he could still escape. His mind raced, grappling with the implications of her words. The safe house in Nuckeln. But that was the very place where the Gestapo would likely be watching. If Elena had betrayed them, if she had been the one to tip off the Nazis about their plans, then the safe house was no longer a safe place. It was a trap. The traitor had led him straight into it. A sudden noise at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. His hand instinctively moved to the pistol at his side, the cold steel grounding him in the present. He wasn't alone. The Gestapo had arrived. With a deep breath, Daniel made his choice. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the letter and stuffed it into his coat pocket, making a split-second decision to burn his bridge with the Allies. He wasn't going to run to the safe house. Not now. Not when the only thing he could trust was the truth that had just been revealed to him. Elena was gone, and the network of lies and half-truths they had both relied on had unraveled. As the door to the apartment swung open, Daniel turned to face the enemy, his pistol drawn. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for his soul, for the pieces of humanity that remained in a world that had been torn apart by war. And in that moment, the true weight of his decision settled upon him. He would either die here in this apartment, or he would walk away from it all, leaving behind the ghosts of espionage, of betrayal, of lost ideals, and perhaps find a new life in the shadows, beyond the reach of both the Reich and the Allies. But one thing was certain, he would never be the same. And whatever came next, whatever consequences followed this moment, Daniel knew he would have to live with them. As the Gestapo agents entered, he raised his gun. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, a quick, steady rhythm that made Daniel's pulse quicken. He glanced toward the door, his fingers tight around the cold steel of his gun. The world had narrowed to this moment one final choice, one final confrontation. The war, the lies, the betrayal, none of it mattered now. He wasn't running anymore. This was it. The door swung open with a creak, revealing two men in black coats, their hands poised to draw weapons. They were Gestapo officers, their faces hard and cold, trained to suppress fear, but Daniel could see the slightest flicker of recognition in their eyes. They knew who he was. He had been careful, but not invisible. In their world, everyone had a file, and his had been marked for scrutiny. He didn't wait for them to speak. He moved first, stepping quickly to the side and toward the window. Without missing a beat, he dove through the opening, a blur of motion as he forced his body through the narrow gap, landing hard on the ground below. His shoulder slammed against the pavement, the sharp impact rattling his bones. Pain exploded through his body, but he gritted his teeth, shaking it off. There was no time for weakness now. The streets of Berlin were alive with the sounds of war carriages rattling down the cobblestones, the hum of distant explosions, the ever-present murmur of conversations hushed in fear. The city was a fractured shell of itself, its heart bleeding from the cracks of a world that had fallen into chaos. Daniel didn't stop to look around. He didn't have the luxury. His legs carried him faster, each step pounding against the cold stone, his mind already mapping out the path to freedom. He wasn't sure where he was running. The safe house in Nukeln was no longer an option, it had been compromised. The letter Elena had left behind had been a final betrayal. But there was something else now, something driving him forward, beyond the confines of loyalty to the mission, beyond the need to follow the rules. The question of his survival no longer felt like the point. What mattered now was the price of survival, the cost of remaining true to a system that had long since abandoned its humanity. The chaos of the city became a blur as he darted down alleyways, cutting through narrow streets and bypassing the watchful eyes of soldiers on patrol. The plan had changed, there was no longer any hope of escaping unscathed. But perhaps there was one final chance to escape the war itself, to escape the ever-tightening grasp of both the Reich and the Allies. Maybe he could disappear. Start fresh. Begin again, far from this place of constant surveillance and suspicion. But then there was Elena. The thought of her pierced through his resolve like a knife. He couldn't shake her from his mind. The woman who had walked beside him, the woman he had trusted, the woman who had ultimately abandoned him with nothing more than a letter and a shattered future. The betrayal stung, but it was a wound he would have to carry. The war had taken so much, and now it had taken her, too. But Elena wasn't just a casualty of the war. She was a victim of something far worse, the forces of loyalty and survival that had consumed both of them. She had made her choice, and Daniel had made his. They were both players in the same brutal game, trapped by the same cruel rules. His feet carried him onward, toward the edge of the city. He reached the outskirts just as night began to fall, the dark sky cloaking the world in its endless shadows. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know if there was any place safe left for him. But as he slowed his pace and moved deeper into the heart of the unknown, he realized something: survival, in the end, was an illusion. Everyone was running from something, and the world they had once known was gone. He stopped at the edge of a river, its surface dark and rippling with the currents of time. The water seemed to stretch on forever, a mirror of the uncertainty that had settled in his chest. This was it. The final crossroads. There was no going back. Daniel glanced at the water, then back at the city Berlin, the heart of a war that had torn apart everything he had ever known. He had been a soldier once, a servant of the cause. He had believed in duty, in the ideals of his nation, and in the mission that had been entrusted to him. But the mission had never been about ideals. It had always been about survival. And now, after everything that had happened, after the choices he had made, the people he had trusted, and the destruction they had wrought, he knew the truth. The world had changed. And so had he. He couldn't live in the shadow of a past that no longer existed. He couldn't remain loyal to a system that had betrayed him at every turn. Elena's disappearance was the final sign, the final indication that there was nothing left but the wreckage of a lost cause. He wasn't going to keep fighting for a war that was already lost. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the letter Elena had written. It was crumpled, its edges torn from his frantic search, but her words still burned in his mind. She had made a choice to leave, to vanish from the world that had trapped them both. Now, it was his turn. But as he looked down at the letter, Daniel's fingers curled around it. The fire of anger that had burned in his chest began to fade. There was something else there, something softer, something human. A recognition that, like Elena, he too had been a prisoner of a war he never fully understood. He couldn't undo the past. But he could choose what came next. The letter, the symbol of everything they had both lost, was placed gently into the river. He watched as it drifted away, carried by the current. There would be no more running. No more hiding. He would leave Berlin behind, leave the war behind, and find a way to start again, far from the shadows of spies, far from the tyranny of the Reich, far from the broken ideals that had once held him in thrall. The war had stolen too much. But in the end, it hadn't taken everything. He turned his back to the river and walked away, stepping into the darkness. Days passed in a blur of movement and uncertainty. Daniel had disappeared into the underbelly of the city, slipping from safe house to safe house, hiding in plain sight, living off the scraps of information that trickled in from the remnants of the resistance. He had no grand plans now, no mission, no higher purpose. Only the slow, steady hope that he could outrun the ghosts of his past and carve out some semblance of a future. He knew the Gestapo were still looking for him. He knew they would never stop. But he also knew that the game had changed. The world he had once known was gone, and in its place was only rubble. But for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like a pawn in someone else's war. He felt like a man with a future of his own, a future that he would write with his own hands, one step at a time. The final pages of the story were not written in Berlin, not in the rubble of a city that had lost its soul, but in the quiet, anonymous corners of Europe. Daniel Carter had disappeared, but his name would be remembered by few. The choices he had made, the people he had loved, and the war that had shaped him, would remain part of the history of a continent torn asunder by blood and fire. But as he moved forward, forging a new life, one thing remained clear. The war had changed everything, but it had not changed who he was. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The end.